All right, so one of the things that the Industrial Revolution produced has become an enormous topic in anthropology. It's very big. I'm just thinking about how huge class and inequality has been in anthropology. See how big it is? No, it's basically almost been disappeared from anthropology. It's very hard to get anybody to talk about social class and inequality. In this chapter, it gets submerged in the bigger book of this, the cultural, this is the essentials. It's its own chapter, but in this it just gets squeezed in here, this tiny bit. And to talk about this, we draw on people who are not even anthropologists, like our buddy Karl Marx, who back in the 1840s or so, mid-19th century, proposed that capitalism was dividing the world into two main classes: the bourgeoisie, who had control over the means of production, and the proletariat, who were basically the laborers who had nothing to sell but their own labor power. Now, you have to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie. That was the point of the Communist Manifesto. As we divided into only two classes, the proletariat were going to be able to appropriate the means of production and make them work for everybody. How many of you have read the Communist Manifesto? Good. You should all read it before you get out of college. It's like reading the Bible. Everybody should do it, even if you don't believe it. In fact, you should probably read the Bible first, because it's hard to understand Marx without reading the Bible. But it's a good little pamphlet to read. It's not very long, actually. Most of where people get their ideas that Karl Marx said come from the Communist Manifesto, but the Communist Manifesto was written at a time when Marx thought the revolution was about to happen, and it was actually happening. And so the Communist Manifesto is like a big poster that you put on the wall, or a meme that you send around to get people excited about the revolution. It is not necessarily Marx thinking about class analysis. In his later writings, when the revolution didn't really work out, he's much more nuanced about analyzing society, but it's an interesting read. There are many people who believe that in some ways the conditions that Karl Marx described were not so true back then, but are becoming more and more true in today's world. What do we see in today's world? Everybody, yeah. So basically, some people have argued that in fact the world has divided into the billionaires and the rest of us, and that we are finally at the point where we might be able to have this revolution. Seems doubtful, but that's where the world is definitely very unequal. Another person that Guest brings in here is Max Weber, who is seen as somebody who wrote in a more nuanced way than Karl Marx and talked about different social classes, prestige, and life chances. He also talks about the role of the government and what he called the legitimate use of force. We'll come back to him later when we talk about politics. For now, we'll just note that he's been in there talking about class theory. There's another person that Guest draws upon, which is Pierre Bourdieu, who is known for writing about education, the educational system, and social reproduction, and the notion of having not just economic capital, but cultural capital. What is this cultural capital? How do you get it, and what does it do?
By having wealth, you create cultural.
By having wealth, you learn the ways in which you reproduce that wealth, and you learn how to bring bottles of wine to people's houses and get around and get a job. And so what Bourdieu argues is that in some ways the educational system is not necessarily addressing social inequality, it's actually perpetuating social inequality. We talked about how college is often a sorting mechanism in which people from the same social class come together and get to know each other and reproduce these social ideas. I'm going to skip what Bourdieu says about the happiness because it's too complicated. I wanted you to think about these three people that guest cites here for insights about social class inequality. You have Karl Marx, who was born in Germany and lived over there during these years. Max Weber, also born in Germany, lived a little bit longer. And Pierre Bourdieu, born in France and is mostly known as a French theorist, lived over there. You might ask yourself, who's missing from this? Yeah, I don't know, sure.
America and Britain?
America! Where the heck are we? In fact, we're in a cultural anthropology class in the United States, and you'd think we'd have something to say about social class and inequality, and we have to draw on these guys way over there? Like 100 years ago? Crazy. Later on, Guest talks about one of the contributions that American anthropologists have made, which was an idea that Oscar Lewis had, which was that people end up in a culture of poverty. The idea is that you're in an unequal situation, but you get in this cycle. Now, Lewis, his idea was that you needed to address the culture of poverty, you needed massive intervention in order to address the inequalities of U.S. society. But let me ask you this. If I say that so-and-so is poor because they're in a culture of poverty, what does that make you think? Am I going to be able to help you out if the reason you're poor is because you're in a culture of poverty? It makes it sound like that's their destiny. It's their own fault. I would say that the culture of poverty is perhaps the worst idea that an anthropologist has ever had. Not necessarily on its face, but because of how it was used in the world. Because of the ideas that it gave to people, like, you can't help those people. They're stuck in their culture of poverty. They'll never change. So this was not our best. It also contributed to the myth that we have that we live in a classless society. And so one of the things that we believe about our society is that we're going to be a billionaire over time, and that we're going to rise up, and we're going to know that we don't have these social chances, or that under neoliberalism we don't need the government, or we don't need, because the markets are going to take care of everything and make everybody the same, or make everybody equal. However, what we see in American society when we actually run the numbers is a huge disparity of income. And so this is highly unequal in U.S. society, how much money people make. But at least we know about it. At least with income, you can know and report on how much you have, as compared to wealth. So, what's the difference between income and wealth?
Wealth is what you have saved up.
Yeah, wealth is all the stuff, the resources that you have. Income is what you're making year after year. If I have wealth, what's the first thing I want to do with wealth? I definitely want to preserve my wealth. How do I do that? Yeah. Well, yeah, I do want to make it grow. That's true too. I don't want to give it up. I want to grow it. I often want to invest in things, but I also want to hide it. I want to make sure nobody knows about it. I want it somewhere where it can't be found. I want to make sure nobody's taxing me on my wealth. It's actually very difficult to figure out how much wealth people have in our society because everybody that has it is trying to hide it. At least with income, you have an income tax. And that's what we tax people, and we don't tax people on their wealth. And so many of the world's wealthiest people in the United States, it's a little trick that they have. So they have a lot of wealth in, say, the stock market. And then they take out a loan on that money, and they live based on the loan that they've taken. And so on their income taxes, they have no income tax. They have no income. Beautiful. Wonderful system. By the way, if I gave you $1 million, not just that dollar, well, let us say that I gave one of you $1 million, what would you do? What would be the top 3 things on your list to do?
Invest.
That would be the smart thing to do. What would most people do, though? All right, so you're going to pay off your car, you're going to pay off your college, your debt. That's all good. Then what are you going to do?
Not tell anyone.
You're all smart about that. What do you think most people would do with this? By the way, spend it on stupid. Buy a new car.
Buy a new house.
Buy a new house. Drop out of college. What do you need this college for? I got $1 million.
I feel like it's not that much anymore.
It's really not.
It's not that much anymore.
Maybe if it was like the 1970s or 80s, it was still a lot like crazy, but like.
If I were an expat, $1 million, I'm out of the country.
You're gone. Yeah, see? There you go. But that's smart. You got to get out. There are studies done that most people who win the lottery within 5 years are back to where they were. I mentioned $1 million. A couple years ago, I knew this family. It was 3 people, and their parent passed away and left each of them $1 million. And what was interesting is there was no visible change in these people's lives. Saw nothing. Nothing changed. And that's how you have wealth, because it didn't have any impact on them. And I don't know what they did with it. They probably just invested more. But you see what I mean? That's what the wealthy people are trying to do. Wealth in this country is even more unequal than income, if we even know where it is. So when he doesn't even have this table in this book. When we think about income gaps, for example, this was the median income, the difference between income between white and black, for example, on the median is about 1.7. But in terms of wealth, it's more like around 8 times as much. When you saw that film that I showed you about race, and they were saying that like if you just make income comparisons, then it looks like there's difference. But if you make wealth comparisons, if people at the same wealth level of being white and black, their rates of education, welfare use, all those things are actually the same. So the point of this is that 100 years ago, anthropology, we come out and we step into a world that is organized ethnocentrically, and the idea of us being civilized and those people being primitive. It is also organized by racial hierarchies, which we call racism, but is perhaps better characterized as an anti-blackness and a favoritism for whiteness, and class inequalities. And anthropology comes in with this big and great idea that we have that culture is much more important than biology, or that our learned behavior is more important than what we thought at the time, which was a biological determinism. Now, where does the idea of culture work the best in terms of addressing these hierarchies? Where might it be most effective? Gone dry. All you have to do is answer this question. You only have, this is my second to last question, and then it's all done. You have to think, where is it most effective, or maybe where is it least effective? There, those are my 2 questions. Where is the idea of culture? If you wanted to think about these hierarchies, where is it going to be most effective, and where is it going to be least effective?
How we treat others.
How we treat others. What do we call that? Hint, it's up there on the slide. Oh, what kind of others?
That's not other people.
Yeah, I know. Orientalism. I you're on to it. There's your first answer. Yeah, it's probably going to be most effective when it comes to ethnocentrism. How we treat others in terms of how we think of people as primitive or civilized. Yeah, Peter.
Is it least effective in regards to class?
I would think so. If you start trying to think that people in a different social class is because of their culture, it's nice to be nice to people in different social classes, but that's a relationship of inequality which culture is not necessarily addressing. And so we end up in this place, and race is in the middle. It's like if we deny the inequality of racism because we ascribe it to culture rather than biology, then we really haven't made much progress in addressing those issues. And that is why, interestingly, 100 years later, when I handed you that quote from Ruth Benedict from 100 years ago, you thought it had been written last year or in recent memory. because we're in fact dealing with some of the very same issues today. The question is, are the tools of anthropology enough to address those issues?